Yep. This is Brad Lovelace. I'm secretary from Topeka.
I'm Mike Miller. I'm Assistant Secretary in Pratt.
Chris Tymason, legal counsel.
Yep. This is Brad Lovelace. I'm secretary.
All right, Sheila Kimmis, admin support.
Sorry, that was Gary on the phone. I had to answer his call. He's having trouble getting in. I'm going to send him the link again. So.
Okay. All right, thank you. Sheila, are there any additions or deletions to the agenda today?
No, there's no changes.
Okay. Having no changes to the agenda, I would entertain a motion that if there are no additions or corrections, we approve the minutes of August 5.
So moved.
Seconded, Commissioner Sill.
Been moved and seconded that the minutes be approved. All those in favor say aye.
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 You look awfully nice, Aaron.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, good for my image to hang around with people like you and Brad wearing ties. Okay, this is the time we have set aside and welcome general public comment on non-agenda items. If there are issues or people want to bring up something, I'm guessing you use the raised hand feature. Is that right, Jason?
Correct. If anybody in the public has a topic they want to discuss, just use the raise hand function. They've kind of moved it around. It's now found under reactions on the toolbar as you scroll over the window. So you can click on that and then raise hand and it'll get you to the top of the list, or you can chat with me directly and I'll make sure that the chairman knows. Looks like we got Brad Max here. Let me unmute you, Brad, and you should be.
Okay, good.
Well, should be unmuting you, Brad. Do one more step. I'm just going to make you a co-host real quick, Brad, so that you can unmute yourself because it doesn't seem to be allowing me to unmute you.
How is that? Can you hear me?
There we go. Yep.
Okay,
Yeah, we can hear you. Go ahead, Brad.
great. I wanted to find out, and I didn't see Linda among the participants, but wanted to find out if there had been any progress in the last 3 months on the reconstruction or plans for Cedar Point at Milford. I have been out there, and I know that something had gone to Schwab Eaton. They were working on something, but I don't know what that is. I'd be interested in finding out, but I just wanted to see what had happened in the last 3 months.
Linda, are you there where you can answer that?
Mr. Chair, this is Brad Lovelace. Linda isn't able to participate today, but I'm looking through our participants to see if any other of her parks folks are with us. If any of you are, just chime in. I did talk with Linda a little bit about this project, Brad, and I can answer if none of Linda's folks are able to jump in.
I thought Alan was going to be on, but I don't see his name on here. So
Right. Okay. Well, let me.
may not be.
Yeah. Thank you. Let me, Brad. Excuse me. Linda and I talked about this just the other day. They are making progress. I didn't ask her for any details, but that project is moving forward. I asked her because I knew you and other constituents had been interested and had given input. I asked her about that, and she said, in fact, they are utilizing some of the input that you folks gave and found that very valuable. So we appreciate your participation in that. She said they are moving forward. We can get back to you directly with details if you'd like. If you can send your contact information to Jason, we'll make sure to forward that to our parks folks. and we'll respond to you directly about where we're at in the time frame for that. But it is moving forward, and we do appreciate your help.
Okay, I will get you that, or get Jason that contact information right away. Thank you.
Yep, thank you.
Thank you, Brad and Brad. Is there any other hands up, Jason?
Doesn't look like at this point in time. And
All
no
right.
one's chatted with me directly, so.
All right. Before we go into the formal agenda, we had a little informal discussion a little bit ago, and still Lauren had a good question about when we get emails, exactly what are we supposed to do? And the way I'm proposing, and I think it's consistent with Jason's recommendation, is that if the emails come from Sheila, we know the department has already weighed in on it, has them logged, and will be making an answer. If we get an email that comes around the state system to our regular email that's published in the directories and stuff like that, I propose that all emails, including any responses, to which I don't encourage necessarily, I say that all other emails that don't appear to be coming from Sheila be forwarded to Sheila, and then she'll take them from there. The thing we want to do is if sometimes somebody will send an email and they will send it direct to our email addresses around the state or system, and then we don't know whether we're supposed to say anything, whether, you know, Aaron or Lauren or somebody else has responded, and so you don't do anything. And if we all don't do anything, then a constituent says, I sent an email to 6 people and didn't get a response. So I think if we just all funnel them towards Sheila, I was never really sure whether I was supposed to send them to Sheila or Nadia or just exactly who. So at this point, I would go ahead and suggest that we send them all to Sheila.
Okay, Mr. Chair, can I comment?
Yes.
Yeah, so thank you, Brad Lovelace, Secretary. So Sheila and Nadia, this might be a way in to talk about how that's working. And I know we had the plan and we've been discussing. I appreciate you bringing it up, Commissioner Lauber. And so Sheila, does that, and Nadia, does that fit with your understanding of how the process is supposed to work? Our overall goal is to your point, Mr. Chair, to make sure everybody gets responded to, make sure we use our technical staff to help us with that response, and make sure that we are and also share that information with all the commissioners, no matter which way it came in. So Nadia, can you comment first, maybe?
Yes, so Nadia Reimer, Chief of Public Affairs. You'll have to bear with me, guys, because I'm battling a sore throat. So I hope you can hear me okay. But essentially, constituents can navigate, they can find commissioner contact information from a variety of sources. So we've printed that in some publications, we've had it online on various sites. And so it is possible and very likely that as time continues, you're still going to get communication sent directly to you, just like as you said, Chairman Lauber. And so we're trying to mitigate some of that by limiting where your guys' information is published so that we can funnel everyone to chaosoutdoors.com. You guys are absolutely right that we want to start with Sheila because she's going to be maintaining the communications log. So that's our starting point. And then from there, we can ensure that someone from KDWPT responds and that commissioners are CC'd. So that's the protocol we're attempting to use moving forward. So I think we're on the right track.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
Commissioner Feller, just so I'm clear, I get emails through the state system that are kdwpt.websupport@kansas.gov. Do I assume those have been logged, or is that the type I need to forward?
Warren, Commissioner Warren, that would be That'd be one of the ones that would be forwarded. You'll start to receive, once we get it posted, you'll start to receive another one that is for all commissioners, and it'll say for all commissioners in the subject line. And you won't need to forward that one, but the ones that you've been getting from KDWP.web support currently are just from your individual form that we have out there for your email address.
Okay,
And so that one, I would say go ahead and those would go ahead and forward to Sheila.
okay. All right, thank you.
And I'm guessing Sheila may want to throw a rock at me, but more forwarded to Sheila than less is better. I'd rather not miss somebody than create it, it may be a little bit of a burden for her, but when in doubt, forward it to Sheila.
That's correct. That way we can, even if I've seen them, I'll know that they've been logged.
All right. Is there any other questions or comments from the commission on that or staff?
Chairman,
Yes, Chris.
Chris Tymason. I just have one caution is when those emails come to everybody that you don't reply all as a commissioner, because I don't want to have an inadvertent violation of the Open Meetings Act.
Yes, that's a good point.
Commissioner Spore, are we going to see the responses from the department on those emails?
That's the understanding that I have, that once the response has been sent out, we will be getting a copy of it.
Okay,
We'll
thank
probably
you.
be CC'd on the actual response. All right. Any other comments on that? Okay. We might as well start in the department report. Brad Lovelace, Secretary's remarks.
All right, thank you, Chairman Lauber, Brad Lovelace, Secretary. So in terms of our fiscal situation, things are pretty rosy right now. We are working on our preparations for fiscal year 23. We are amending fiscal year 2022 budget right now. Our EDIF apportionment, we've mentioned in the past with tourism shifting over to commerce, we allowed their EDIF money, the state lottery fund money, to go with them, so that they had some fiscal backing for their program starting over there. So our EDIF apportionment will go down to about $3.5 million in the future. Our park fee fund revenue finished up in fiscal year 2021 about 21% from fiscal year 2020. So that was good news. We knew last year was a good year, and certainly the final numbers bore that out. Currently in fiscal year 2022, we're down about 6% from last year, but remember, last year was really a record year. And so down 6% is still not bad. We're still doing very well. Our parks staff have been very busy this summer. Finally, with school starting, things are slowing down, particularly in the West, but still, it's been a very busy year. Our current cash balance in the park fee fund is about 7.2 million. And that's over about 4.3 or 4.4 million where it was this time last year. So a healthy balance there for the park fee fund. Cabin revenue for the last fiscal year that we just completed was up about 47% from the previous year. Remember, of course, we had flooding. So that's part of that's explained by that big jump explained by that. Currently, we're down a little bit from where we were last year, but still feel very comfortable with where we're at with our park fee fund and cabin revenue. On wildlife, the wildlife fee fund is up overall about 8% over where we were last year at this time. We like to keep a healthy balance in that. That's basically our checking account that we work projects out of, and is shared around the agency. Our balance at the end of fiscal year 20 was just over $20 million. Now our balance is about $29 million. So again, looking good compared to the past. We feel very comfortable with that balance. Specifically, when it comes to our wildlife restoration fund and our sport fish fund, those are the revenues that we get from the federal excise taxes on fishing and hunting gear. So the wildlife restoration receipts are, we call the Pittman Robertson Fund, is currently this year, when we talk to the federal government, who's building up those receipts from this year, and then we'll share those with the states. Last year at this time, our ending year balance federally was 824 million. That's for all of last year. This year, we're already up to 834 million federally. So we're very optimistic. At the end of this year, we'll see a new high watermark in terms of those federal tax revenues for wildlife work, and so we'll be very aggressive in trying to get the biggest share of that we can to come to Kansas. So that's looking good. The sport fish funds are a little more confusing right now. In talking with manufacturers, and I was just in a meeting recently where we had discussions with manufacturers, they are all saying they're having record years. Their receipts are all up, their sales are up. Yet the report from the federal government shows that their sales or the taxes from those sales being down a little bit from where they were a year ago. That really doesn't make sense to us or them. So I would put a question mark besides our Dingle Johnson fishery funds and just say, we don't know. We're optimistic that we'll have good revenues to draw from with our state match. But right now we aren't sure of an accurate estimate of those revenues. But federal government's working diligently to go through those figures and give us an accurate projection so we can make plans. But we're optimistic about the fishery funds, and we're very positive about what we've seen so far in terms of wildlife funds. So, Mr. Chair, that concludes my report, and I'm willing to answer questions if there are any.
Any questions? This is Gerald Lauber. Are there any questions for Brad?
Looks like we have Jackie Augustine from the public, Commissioner.
All right, let me remind everybody, of which I'm the worst offender, is that when you speak, try to remember to give your name so that the minutes can reflect who made comments. All right, Jackie.
Oh, my bad, Jackie. Sorry, I pushed the button too quickly.
Hello, I'm Jackie Augustine with Audubon of Kansas. 2 questions. Were there any losses in funding with removing the tourism department from KDWP, and how are those going to be made up? And then secondly, you mentioned an increase in wildlife funds, and how will decisions be made on how the increased funding will be invested either on the ground or financially?
Yep. So, Mr. Chair, if I could respond, Brad Loveless, Secretary. We did, the particular funds that we lost concerning tourism were those EDIF funds that we sent with them. Originally, when they came over here, all that money was within wildlife and parks. We took a portion of that to give to tourism so they could fund their programs. When they left, we let that go with them. So in effect, we lost about $1.5 million or so, 1.7. So that did go with them. But there aren't any other revenues that we received from them. All of the money they received went into fund their programs. So there wasn't any loss in terms of revenue that we skimmed off of in the past. That all went right back into tourism programs. So no loss other than EDIF. And concerning your question about excess funds being used, currently we have a process where all of our divisions work together and basically work out a similar pots. We have a separation between our parks division and everyone else, but fishery ecological services, education, wildlife, all those use these shared pots of money. So we go through a process. We prioritize projects in each division, and they all collaborate and compete basically for those funds. And when we run out of money, those lower priority projects don't get done. So with extra, it simply means that we can do more of those projects that we've been hoping to do in the past but couldn't afford. But the other part of that I'd mentioned, Jack, is that, you know, as we talk with outside groups like the Kansas Wildlife Action Committee about what they think need to be done, their goes into that, helps us determine our priorities. So things that Audubon, Kansas is associated with are important constituents of ours that help us make those decisions.
Thank you.
Gerald Lauber, are there any other discussions? Any other questions? Okay, well, hearing none, let's move into the general discussion portion. The CSA hunting alternative. Keith, is it pronounced Houghton?
You're on mute, Keith.
Unmute him there.
There, you read me now? I told the flight attendants for 30 years that it's Houghton like floating, and they could remember that.
Okay, thank you.
About 2 years ago in discussions, we came to the conclusion that our wildlife and parks commissioners hadn't had very much exposure to our controlled shooting area operations. And we thought we needed to remedy that. We don't have any problems. There's no crisis afoot, but we just think that the CSA thing is becoming a bigger player in complementing what the state does. The agency, in complementing what the agency provides recreational opportunities. The controlled shooting areas have significant evolution from the preserves of your grandfather's era 50 to 75 years ago, when game bird appearance and performance could be very disappointing. The experience of a hunt on today's Kansas CSA can be excellent on those opportunities that are using high quality game birds on development, realistic habitat, and the CSAs offer a complement to agency efforts in providing public opportunities. We've been working for a year and a half to have all the different players of the industry for tours and a seminar on the growing facilities of quality game bird propagation, hospitality, and hunting that continue to involve in what is nothing like your grandfather's hunting preserve. We have transitioned 2 virtual meetings on 2 attempts to have the opportunity that we would hold in conjunction with the Wildlife and Parks Commission meeting at Beloit, Kansas. We are now planning to reschedule this effort for the commission meeting planned for Beloit in the spring of 2022. We would like to include most facets of the industry and plan selected owners and operators, operational personnel, wildlife and parks commissioners, and financial, legislative, enforcement, tourism, and economic development. If you have an interest or know someone who does, please contact me so that we can include you in the opportunities for this meeting. I didn't say who I was. I'm Keith Houghton. I've operated a controlled shooting area for 38 years on the family ranch in north central Kansas.
Are there any questions for Keith? I have a couple of questions, only out of just curiosity. I have been told by people in the chicken industry that there is considerable difference between high performing roosters and those that don't, and there's an effort to maintain the breeding standards. When it comes to pheasants, are all pheasants just pheasants, or do you try to have one particular strain that provides better performance?
There are a half dozen different identified strains. A couple of them came out of Kansas. I can't address that, and that's going to be the best. We talk to the boys who are raising the birds, and we've made giant strides. Our state association, the Kansas Sport Hunting Association, done several things. We brought in the poultry person that does the research with microscopes, and we taught our members how to run a microscope, and is really instrumental in herd and flock health. But I can't address that. Yes, there are strains of birds that seem to do and perform better, and it's probably the evolution. One of the big things that my personal concern about is a lot of stuff we point to the research that was done in the 40s, 50s, and we pretty much poo-paw this thing. We have gained a tremendous scientific foothold in game bird propagation. We get along wonderfully with the pheasant species, quail not so much. They don't lend themselves for captive rearing as much as pheasant, and as a substitute for the pheasant, we do the chucker partridge. The chuckers are just wonderful substitute for the quail situation. If we get our meeting up in Beloit, I'll have somebody to give you a defined answer on that.
Thank you. Are there any other questions for Keith?
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, Mike.
Mike Miller and Pratt. I just want to say Keith has a really fine operation. I think I've known Keith 30 some years, and we visited his operation clear back in the early 80s when we had an outdoor riders meeting, and he has worked really hard to provide a really good hunting experience. That having really good performing birds is really, critical. And that's one of the reasons we've been trying to get a commission meeting to meet up there and see his operation. So it is worth seeing. I think they do fill a niche. There is a customer base that wants what these type of operations provide, in addition to the folks that want to come hunt wild birds. And so I know Keith, I think Ringneck Ranch is one of the top tourism sites in the state. I think he's also one of the top employers in Mitchell County. There's a lot of economic impact from businesses like Keith's. And so I do think it would be beneficial for the commission to finally get up there and see his operation and see the hatchery operations that they work with on the bird side of it. So I hope we can get back to some in-person meetings this spring and visit the operation in south of Tipton.
I concur. Any other questions? Well, let's move on to see what Matt Peak has to tell us.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the commission. Since this is the first time talking about pronghorn in this regulatory cycle, I'll give a little bit of an overview of the program. And then I'll discuss our regulations recommendations for the season. So we've had a pronghorn season, a hunting season in Kansas since 1974. Since 1990, we've had a 4-day firearms season beginning on the first Friday in October. And this is a Monday through Friday season. The other seasons are the starting dates are then based off the dates of the firearms season. The primary 9-day archery season has been in place since 1985. And since 2005, the archery season has reopened the weekend after the firearms season and continued through the end of October. So that gives archery hunters an extra 15 to 20 days of late season opportunity. The muzzleloader season was initiated in 2001. And it has began immediately after the archery season and ran for 8 days. The first 4 of which, a Monday through Thursday, are just muzzleloader season. And then the last 4 days of that season overlap with the 4-day firearms season. With the exception of annual adjustments in permit allocations, this regulation has basically been the same since about 2006. So we've had fairly stable regulations that for hunters to follow in the case of pronghorn. We have hunting in the pronghorn occur in western Kansas, mostly in the western 2 or 3 tiers of counties. And there are 3 units open to hunting. And there's a figure in the regulations that show those units. They're units 2, 17, and 18. And those are consistent with the deer management units for hunter simplicity. So they really extend eastward, pretty much beyond the range of where you'd consistently find pronghorn, but we made them the same as the deer units, again, just for simplicity for hunters. Archery permits are good in all 3 units. They're unlimited and they're available to both residents and non-residents. The muzzleloader and firearm permits are unit specific and they're also limited draw. So hunters are applying for them and getting preference points. It typically, and there's usually over 1,000 hunters apply for those permits. So demand is high for pronghorn hunting, and especially considering there are usually only about 200 permits available. It typically takes about 1 to 3 preference points for a muzzleloader hunter to draw a permit for a general resident muzzleloader hunter, and it takes 3 to 5 preference points for a general resident to draw a firearm permit. And then landowners are allocated half of the permits, and it usually only takes them 0 to 2 points to draw. Of course, there's a much smaller pool of landowner applicants to compete against each other. The firearm and muzzleloader permits are available to residents only, and I think I already said the archery permits are resident or non-resident. I provided the hunting season dates in the briefing book, and I won't go over them. Again, they're standard for what they have been. Typical success rates are about 15% for archery permit holders, 60% for muzzleloader permit holders, and 70% for firearm permit holders. We will determine the specific permit allocations after the ongoing season is ended, which it just began last Saturday for archery hunters. So it's just now getting underway. And then also we will conduct we usually wait on the results of winter aerial surveys before we come up with the next season's permit allocations. So the last thing I would say is that we do post all of the harvest and population reports on the KDWP website, as we do for most species. If you go to that species section on the website, then there's a research and surveys tab. So there's a lot of the information we collect on them is available out there to the public and anyone else that wants to look at it. So with that, I'll turn this back over to you, Mr. Chairman.
Gerald Lauber here. I have a couple of questions. First of all, based on the way you described it, a permit is issued either for the use of a muzzleloader or the use of a firearm. Unlike deer, where you have a permit, you could use your choice of weapon. That's my question number 1. And question number 2, to qualify as a landowner for the landowner tenant draw, do you have to own property in that area, or do you qualify just as a landowner in the general definition and maybe own land elsewhere outside of units 2, 17, and 18?
Matt Peak, Emporia Research and Survey Office. On the second question, with all big game permits, you have to own land within the unit that in which you're applying, and you have to own or manage, be a tenant on at least 80 acres. So if they were applying in unit 2, they would have to own land in unit 2. In other words, a person who owns land in Osage County can't apply for a unit 2 pronghorn permit as a landowner. And then on your first question about hunting equipment, you are correct for the most part. Within the big game regulations, if you get a firearm permit, you can technically hunt with any equipment that's lesser than a firearm. So a firearm permit would allow you to hunt with archery or muzzleloader or pistol, but there is no any weapon unit-wide permit the way there is with the any season whitetail tag, for example. Is that clear?
That's exactly my question. And good answer. So are there any other questions for Matt on antelope? Okay, hearing none, you want to go on and talk about elk?
Sure. And I'll do the same thing and sort of give you a little bit of an overview of the elk program to start with here. Elk were first introduced onto Fort Riley in 1986, and a hunting season was initiated there in 1990. And Fort Riley is the best opportunity for the typically for your average general resident in the state. So when we have these, we do have broadly open, the area you can elk hunt in the state is broad, but for most general residents, the most likely way for them to kill an elk is to draw one of the permits to Fort Riley and go hunt there. So we do have elk scattered around the remainder of the state on private lands, and mostly in most of the state, they provide what I would call an opportunistic opportunity for hunters when they unexpectedly show up in an area. And the hunter happens to be lucky enough to have access where one of these elk show up. And you've heard me mention before, and this has held true in recent years, that we've had an elk has been harvested out of over a quarter of the counties in Kansas over the last 5 years. And so the counties are changing a little bit over time, but where we lose a couple of counties that were now, from 6 and 7 years ago, we pick up a few each year, it seems. And so typically that's held true, and elk are being harvested widely across the state. And then the third hunting opportunity that some people find themselves to have with elk is that there are several herds, mostly smaller herds on private lands scattered around the state. And in many cases, these herds are the result of specific landowners who want these elk and who maintain the herds by protecting hunting access to them. And so and in many cases, they manage for them as well. And so that is also part of the purpose of our broad regulations, is that we allow people to harvest them where they're not wanted, but we allow them to be protected by certain landowners and sort of managed a little in other cases so that they are maintained where people want them. And that's really the main lesson that we learned, I think, from if you look back at our historical elk management in the case of Cimarron National Grasslands and on Fort Riley, we probably overprotected those elk early on, and they increased in abundance until the damage around those populations became severe. And then due to various pressures, we wound up having to issue a lot of permits and really knock those populations way down. And so our current system, although it is somewhat aggressive in some cases, it has prevented that type of a situation from happening where we've been basically forced to issue and heavily harvest elk out of the populations that we do have. And on the Cimarron is another area of elk in the state that people often ask about. And of course, elk were reintroduced there. The last season that occurred out there was in 1995, and they were basically reduced in number, and to some degree they moved into Colorado and Oklahoma, but elk are not typically found there predictably. And so that is the one area of the state. And again, there's a unit figure in your briefing book, but unit 1 down there around in Morton County that encompasses the grassland is the one area of the state where elk hunting is not currently allowed. So moving on sort of to our recommendations, we're not anticipating any changes to the season structure or bag limits or permit types with elk this year. The season dates are in the briefing book. I won't take the time to go through them and read them off, but we do have this, for the most part, the seasons off of Fort Riley are consistent with, in many ways, with the deer seasons, so that hunters out there with wearing orange with a rifle in hand during the rifle deer season, that's also the rifle elk season. And then Fort Riley's a different deal where the season on it is divided into 1 month segments. And The one thing I will mention is during the main October, November, December, the main segments there, any elk permit holders can hunt during any of those 3 months, whereas the antlerless elk permit holders are forced to choose one of those 3 months. And that helps limit crowding and stuff like that on the fort. Probably allows us to issue a few more permits total. In the case of elk, I'll mention that we have a bonus point system for them, which is different than the pronghorn. The pronghorn is a preference point system, so the person with the highest number of preference points gets the permit. With the bonus point system, as is the case with elk, you get a chance in the draw for every year that you've applied. So a first-time applicant has one chance in the draw, whereas a person who's applying for their 5th year has 5 chances in the draw. And the reason for that is the demand for these permits is so high. If you had a true preference point, it would be many years until anybody who didn't apply in the first year ever drew. And so this bonus point system is a typical way to sort of fairly allocate permits. It weights those who have applied for longer, but first-time applicants also have a chance to draw. So there is an incentive for new applicants to go ahead and get into the pool. We usually, same as with pronghorn, we usually determine permit allocations for the coming season later, after the current season is a little farther along. And sometimes we have aerial survey results that Fort Riley conducts on Fort Riley. So with that, I will turn this back over to you, Mr. Chairman.
Gerald Lauber. Thank you, Matt. How many, I have 2 questions. How many applicants do we average a year? And how many permits do we give out?
We have, we've typically had over 1,000 applicants for elk, and so demand is high. And then on the permits given out, we've been giving out, well, let's see, I think 12 any elk permits and 18 antlerless elk permits on Fort Riley. And off of Fort Riley, I didn't mention this, but in the major unit, unit 3, the bulk of the state, permits are unlimited for both general residents and landowner tenants. So yeah, we're issuing 30. We've issued the last several years 30 limited draw permits for Fort Riley.
Do most of those permits get filled?
Yes, any elk permits are typically about 75% successful, and the antlerless elk permits are not quite as successful. I mentioned they don't get to hunt quite as long, but they probably also aren't quite as determined in many cases due to not being able to get an antlered, it's not for an antlered permit. So but typically they're more like 50%, 35 to 50% success.
Are there other questions for Matt from anybody?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Commissioner Gefeller. Matt, if I heard right, we've introduced elk to Fort Riley and to the Cimarron grasslands, but not in any other parts of the state. Is that correct?
Map Peak Research and Survey Office. Yes, that's correct.
Okay. So the elk we find in the other areas just are elk that either wander off those 2 locations or come in from Colorado or elsewhere. Is there any, I guess what I'm wondering is there any thought to introducing elk to other parts of the state? And what's the objective with the program?
Well, there's not been any discussion of introducing them elsewhere. I think I learned Lloyd Fox's name was mentioned earlier. And so something I learned from him in the case of river otters is it's better to let them get there on, a species that can be controversial if they can get there on their own. agency's probably better off letting them do that in many cases than facing the brunt of being the ones who brought the species in that's now causing problems. And so it would be best if they got to wherever they're going to be on their own. And then I mentioned that our current regulatory approach is based on letting them be where people are willing to tolerate them. You know, the concept of the social carrying capacity is what's really at play here. And in some cases, a small number of them, you know, less than 10 may be tolerated. In other cases, like in Western Kansas on the Ark River, you know, the herd out there is over 60 to 80 or more. And people out there really like them and manage for them and protect access to them and everything else. And so it just depends on the area of the state and where landowners are who have a big enough chunk of contiguous land to support them.
Yeah. Do they tend to herd up? I mean, if there's a small group in one county and a small group in a neighboring county, will they find their way together and herd up?
Well, they do like to herd up. There are cases where there are small groups of them reproducing, and there may be other ones around. So, I mean, they do to some degree, but they also travel widely across the landscape. And so they do at some point obviously leave those groups. And so you ask about the source of a lot of these animals, you know, individuals do pick up and leave Fort Riley and travel across the state and stuff. And so in some instances, maybe it's a matter of chance that you wind up with a few cows and a bull running into each other out in some distant area. The source of the Western Kansas elk is probably Colorado, more so than it was our reintroductions onto Cimarron. So they've come here naturally. And then for the elk that are showing up everywhere else, some of them are coming off of Fort Riley, and then some of them are coming from these other little, even smaller than the Ark River population, where there may be 5 to 20 elk in little herds that are producing enough animals that some of them are scattering out of there.
Okay, thank you. Interesting. Yeah.
Any other questions for Matt? I have one. There's probably 150 to 200 animals in the Fort Riley herd. And do we have 500 elk in the state, if you were to throw a guess?
Yeah, we're close to that. We typically estimate between 450 and 5, but we would say that there's closer to 300 up there around Fort Riley. And obviously we're not able to, you're not able to really survey the elk when they're scattered around in some instances. But if you add up sort of where some of these little populations that we know of with the Fort Riley herd, and then just sort of estimate what else is out there, yeah, you're in the 450 to 500 range.
Okay. Are there any other questions for Matt? Well, then let him go on and talk about swift foxes.
Okay, actually, Ty Wardell is going to do this one. I'll just say a quick word about swift fox, though. This is a species of conservation interest in Kansas, and it's not really adequately monitored by our other fur bearer surveys due to the small sample size. And so in the past, we've done track surveys and different stuff to try to better keep a handle on swift fox populations. Several years ago, Adam Allers out of K-State wrote up a proposal, and we were able to get it funded. So we're working with K-State on this research project now, and Ty Wardell is the student out there, and he'll be talking about his efforts to survey swift fox in Western Kansas now.
Thanks, Matt, for the introduction. I'm going to share my screen here. I got a little presentation set up. Can everybody see that?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, like Matt said, I'm a PhD candidate here at Kansas State. Been doing it's the fourth year on this research project. So I'll be talking a little bit about our initial results for first chapter of my dissertation. So we'll talk about how multi-scale landscape effects impose range limiting constraints on the distribution of swift fox. This is a paper that has been submitted for peer review. So I have some co-authors, Colleen Piper, Dr. Ricketts, Matt Peak, and Dr. Adam Allers. So the Great Plains have historically been dominated by native prairies. Landscape change of the Great Plains have likely modified carnivore ranges. The loss of these native prairies likely negatively affect all wildlife communities. However, carnivore species are generally the most sensitive to these changes because of their large home range requirements, slower life histories, and potential for negative human interactions. Range limiting processes at these range edges are complex, and human modified landscapes create patchy and isolated habitats for these carnivores. Specifically, swift fox are small prairie obligate carnivores. They're about 3 kilograms and 30 centimeters tall. They occur at low densities in Kansas, and their prey includes small mammals, insects, and birds, pretty much anything they can catch. Their predators include coyotes, badgers, raptors, and bobcats, and they dig burrows in suitable soils for protection from these predators and to raise their kits. Human modified landscape change has created a mosaic of land use types, as you can see by this raster that kind of shows a section of Kansas, with Conservation Reserve Program lands, or CRP, being a highly effective conservation effort to restore and conserve prairie obligate species. CRP is a voluntary participation by farmers and landowners in an attempt to improve water quality, reduce soil erosion, and has the added benefit to increase habitat for endangered and threatened species. However, we have a limited understanding of how CRP affects swift fox. Previous research indicates that good quality swift fox habitat includes a greater proportion of grasslands that are less than 30 centimeters tall and loamy soils. Most ecologists look at distribution models to reveal occurrences of species at the edge of their range, with covariates or landscape types often obtained from circular buffers, likely the size of a home range around a specific sampling site. And the assumption of these models is that these variables have a constant effect regardless of the distance, as you can see by this top graph here. We believe that this could be enhanced by using a continuous function, where we looked at distance of these proportions of landscape away from the sampling site. So our objectives for this 4-year study were to assess how landscape composition structures swift fox distributions on the edge of their range, which is western Kansas. We had a 3 years of field seasons looking at presence absence data of swift fox. We predicted that shortgrass prairie and loamy soils would increase the probability of occupancy by swift fox, and that row crop agriculture, as well as landscape diversity and CRP, would decrease our probability of swift fox occupancy. So looking at previous research, we saw that Savada created a map of confirmed observations and fur harvest records across the entirety of the range of swift fox in the United States. So we randomly generated 400 potential sites within the western third of Kansas, which is about 7.16 million hectares. And this encompasses all of the confirmed observations of swift fox in Kansas, other than the one central Kansas swift fox observation. We secured private landowner and public land permissions for 381 camera trap locations. This was quite an effort getting private landowners to allow us on their property to put up game cameras, but we were successful. At each one of these sites, we set up a game camera about 40 centimeters high with a scent stake smeared with Vaseline and skunk essence about 3 meters in front of that camera. This technique has been used for other carnivore studies. It entices carnivores in the area to walk in front of the camera. So we did that to maximize our detection for swift fox. Each of these cameras was in place for 28 days per site, and we rebaited with skunk essence after 14 days. This was also placed during the kit fox rearing season of the spring and summer, so that we were less likely to document dispersing swift fox. So we're looking at areas where swift fox were actually utilizing during their kit rearing season. So I created a custom land cover raster in ArcGIS. This is looking at all the different land cover classes in western Kansas. 14 land cover classes derived from 3 data sources, which included Prairie Map, Cropscape, and CRP from Farm Service Agency. As you can see, there's quite the mosaic of landscape types out there in western Kansas. We also looked at loamy soils throughout the western part of the state. And to make our study a little novel, we looked at the distance weighted representation of these land cover covariates. And to do that, we created 200 concentric rings around each of these sampling sites, which totaled to 76,000 rings, but 200 at each site. So what we'd do is we'd create a ring, look at the proportion of our important land cover types around that site, then we'd do it again, and so on until we had 200 of these rings around each one of these sites. Doing that, we developed a distance weighted function to look at the optimal scale of effect at each one of these land cover types for swift fox. And as you can see, our important land cover types have differing scales that elicits a response from swift fox. Out in the field, we collected our data, our images, and these were uploaded into a CPW photo warehouse, which is a Colorado Parks and Wildlife database. And this allowed us to export our data for analyses. So we did multiple analyses on these, but most importantly, we used occupancy models to look at swift fox distribution. We used 28 days per site with 1 day detection histories per site. And to model for detection, we used scent, day of year, and the number of days where disturbance altered the camera view field. I'm sure many of you are familiar with western Kansas. We have a lot of cattle out there, and if we put a camera out in the middle of a pasture, cattle would definitely come investigate and many times knock the camera over. So we have to include that in our models. So after we fit our detection models, we fit our occupancy models, looking at loamy tableland soils, diversity index of land cover types in the area, as well as row crop agriculture, shortgrass prairie, and CRP. And then after fitting our occupancy models, we would fit our colonization models. So over the 3 years, we ended up with 28,000 trap days, with 10,000, 9,000, and 8,000 on the year. We did lose a few landowners through the 3 years. That resulted in 5 million photos. As you can see, there's almost 2 million photos each of the years. Swift fox were observed at 55 sites. That included 341 individuals, with 207 in 2018. 2019, we had 40, and in 2020, we had 94. Just to put that number of photos in perspective, if I looked at each one of those photos, that's 5,217,641,000 seconds, 86,000 minutes. That's 181 8-hour days, 36 40-hour work weeks. So 9 months of 40-hour work weeks and round the clock tagging for about 3 years. So it was pretty Herculean effort to get these photos all tagged after getting our data. But getting into actual swift fox results, we had a naive occupancy, meaning unadjusted for detection, which is just a proportion of our sites that had swift fox. We had 0.08, 0.04, and 0.06. Colonization, which is described as a site not having a swift fox the previous year, but in the following year having a site. We had 13 sites in 18 to 19, and then 17 sites from 19 to 20. Extinction, not thinking about that as like a species extinction, but just a site extinction. So if a site in a previous year had a swift fox occupied, and then the following year not occupied. We see that in 18 to 19, we had 27 sites go extinct, and in 19 to 20, we had 10 sites. And interestingly enough, persistence, where we have a swift fox on a site and then a swift fox on a site the next year, we had only 3 sites from 18 to 19 and 19 to 20 that had swift fox persist at that exact site. So it's a pretty dynamic prey and egg system out there in western Kansas. So looking at our detection models, I won't get into the details of this, but what this graph is showing is that scent, day of year, and camera alteration was important to model the detection for these cameras. And after 28 surveys, which is 1 day per survey, we had a 0.97 detection probability, which is almost 100%. So 28 days was an appropriate amount to have a camera out there. With our initial detection of swift fox at 9 days, meaning the first time we saw a swift fox on camera averaged 9 days after placement of camera, and 54% of all initial detections happened after day 6. So many studies in other states have been looking at 7-day camera surveys. Unfortunately, based on our results, I don't think that they have their cameras out there long enough, because half of our actual detections were after that. So when we look at occupancy, which is the probability that we have swift fox in that area, we see that the important land cover types in western Kansas are CRP, loamy soils, shortgrass prairie, and SHDI, which is land cover diversity. With CRP having a negative effect on swift fox occupancy on the lower right there. As CRP increases, we see a negative relationship with swift fox occupancy. As expected, proportion of shortgrass prairie, as that increases, we have an increased probability of swift fox occupancy, loamy soils as well. And then land cover diversity, we see a quadratic effect. We're at about a median level of land cover diversity. Swift fox occupancy maxes out, and then as we increase that, it declines. So colonization, the probability that a swift fox will recolonize a site after it was not occupied the year before, we find similar results where loamy soils, land cover diversity, and CRP are the main drivers for swift fox in the region, with land cover diversity being negatively influencing colonization. As land cover diversity increases, we see a reduction in swift fox colonization. And as CRP increases, we see a reduction in swift fox colonization, with loamy soil having a positive effect on that. To visualize this, we looked at our most supported occupancy model of swift fox in the western part of the state, with the bluish areas having high probability of swift fox occupancy, and the red areas having a low probability of swift fox occupancy. And this lines up pretty well with shortgrass prairie and loamy soils throughout the western part of the state, with CRP actually having, some of those red pockets throughout the region. So similar to previous research, the proportion of shortgrass prairie was important for initial site occupancy. We have very small shortgrass prairie mean patch sizes, meaning that agriculture throughout the region has kind of limited the actual mean size of these shortgrass prairie patches. But maybe swift fox are perfectly happy with those small sizes. So based on the theory of ideal free distribution, we see that once a critical population density is attained within these patches, swift fox fitness is likely depressed, and individuals may colonize less preferred habitats, such as row crop agriculture. And also, coyotes may be excluding swift fox from areas of greater paid densities, such as CRP. So coyotes might be what's actually driving these CRP results. Loamy soils were important for both initial site occupancy and colonization. This has been shown in previous research as well. It's friable enough for digging for dens and does not cave in on itself. And prairie dog colonies are found almost exclusively in loamy soils in western Kansas. We can't manage for soils, so it may serve as a geologic boundary for the edge of Swift Fox Range. Land cover diversity seems to reach a threshold before inhibiting initial site occupancy, with greater diversity resulting in lower colonizations. Because Swift fox are prairie obligate species, an increase in land cover diversity likely correlates with these smaller shortgrass prairie patches. And moving through non-shortgrass prairie land cover types might expose Swift fox to predation or human conflict. One of the most interesting findings is that CRP had a negative influence on both initial site occupancy and colonization. It's important to note that our measure of CRP includes multiple management practices. Many of these were directed for bird species, with species like big blue stem, switchgrass, and Indian grass, but it may be reducing functional connectivity between shortgrass prairie patches. And future work should probably focus on understanding the population level consequences for Swift fox as the land cover shifts to CRP land cover if our enrollment practices out in western Kansas are increasing or decreasing. So although CRP has been successful conserving and restoring other prairie obligates, the actual structure, meaning the vegetation height, does not adequately mimic traditional Swift fox habitat of shortgrass prairies. I think farmers will be happy to know that row crop agriculture had a neutral influence on Swift fox occupancy and colonization. Based on our data and our photos, we see a lot of Swift fox in agricultural lands, whether that's fallow land or cornfields or wheat fields. And this could be due to greater small mammal abundance, irrigation and pivots could be providing water for them. Either way, it's not negatively affecting Swift fox out in western Kansas. So our methods, because we did a scale of effect, provides managers a specific scale to implement conservation or recreation or restoration strategies as they see fit. And there's an opportunity for Swift fox to recolonize some of their native range, but conservation efforts need to identify and focus on the scale of specific adaptive management of landscape at their range edges. So for the future and my upcoming chapters, we'll be looking at predicting Swift fox occupancy dependent on future CRP enrollments, looking at strategic enrollments of CRP and where that might benefit Swift fox the most or hurt them the most. We'll also be looking at how coyotes may be a driver of temporal and spatial activity patterns and distributions of Swift fox, seeing if coyotes are maybe the main reason that Swift fox aren't recolonizing some of these areas, as they're one of the main predators of Swift fox. And then I'll also be looking at how carnivore community dynamics and richness is shaped depending on landscape composition in western Kansas. And that would include badgers, bobcats, coyotes, Swift fox out in the region. So with that, I'd like to thank KDWPT, also the Nature Conservancy, and especially the private landowners. Over 380 of them allowed us to do this research out in western Kansas, and technicians that worked very hard over the last 4 years to get our data. And with that, I'd take any questions from all of you.
Gerald Lauber, good presentation, Ty. Are there any incidents of conflict between people and Swift fox? Is there any conflict with ranches or anything? You wouldn't think no bigger than they were there would be much.
You know, speaking as someone that's not a rancher in western Kansas, it's hard for me to know the attitudes, but anecdotally, speaking to them, I would say it's about 50-50 on whether they want them around or not. Some ranchers and farmers, because they're carnivores, just don't like having them around. I mean, there's always danger to chickens or cats, etc. But no, I don't think there's much conflict that needs to happen with swift fox because, they're not dangerous to calves or sheep or anything like that. And so, yeah, I don't think really it's just would be an ideological conflict with them.
Okay, I have another question. Are they a particularly desired fur bearer, or are they just an incidental take fur bearer?
I think Matt would probably have a better answer for that, but right now it seems like they are incidental, but they're pretty prized by trappers when they do get them.
Are there other questions for Ty?
I see Jackie's got her hand raised.
Unmute you, Jackie.
Hi, I'm Jackie from Audubon of Kansas. Interesting results and very lots of thought put into how to put this out and how to analyze the results. But I was just curious about whether you think the CRP detections were low because CRP is generally thicker and the area that you're looking for foxes would be less, because the pictures you've showed very short grass and wide areas where you could see them from a distance.
Great question, Jackie. And we thought of this when we were setting out our cameras. I should have mentioned we cleared all the grass and all the vegetation in front of the cameras on that first day and the 14th day with a weed cutter, so that the actual height of the grass didn't impede our detection of animals walking in front of it.
So how big of a distance did you weed eat?
It'd be 2,500 square meters. We actually did.
Okay, thank you.
50 by 50. Yeah.
This is Gerald again.
250 meters. Sorry.
I'm assuming that the species is not in need of any particular conservation, but since we haven't been able to figure out exactly where they are until maybe now, we don't know.
What's that? Oh, whether they're a species of conservation concern?
Well, they're not listed, of course. I mean, do we think we have a declining amount of swift fox? Some of your charts look like we maybe had some increases in certain areas.
Yeah, I would definitely not saying we're decreasing in Kansas. I think we're one of the strongholds of the species within their range here although it's the eastern edge of their range, they cover a pretty significant portion of the western part of the state. So I wouldn't consider them of any concern, but if management strategies would like to see an increased range or to see them recolonize some of their eastward areas, there's things we can do.
Are there other questions for Ty?
Commissioner Spore, Ty, can you explain to us how you chose your camera locations?
Yeah, this was actually random. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Arcgis. It's a spatial software. We chose that western third of the state, which included almost all of the confirmed observations within the last 20 years. And then randomly, the computer software randomly chose 400 sites. Each one of those sites was greater than 2 kilometers apart. And that was so we lessened our chances of getting the same swift fox on multiple cameras. And when we got on the ground at these random sites where we had permission to be on the property, we would try to get as close as possible to that random site, as long as it wasn't in the middle of an agricultural field, because we didn't want to inhibit farmers from harvesting or planting or spraying. So we'd put the camera on the edge of the field if it was a farm field. If it was in the middle of the pasture, the first year we put it right on the exact spot in the middle of a pasture where the cattle are present. But we learned pretty quickly after the first year that cattle would knock these cameras down. So then we would set the cameras as close as possible on the outside of the fence with the scent stake on the inside of the fence, so we could still get the fox or any other species within that pasture, without having cattle disrupt the camera. If it wasn't a production area, we put it on the exact random location.
If you, out of every, how many what do I want to say? For every swift fox, did you see 10 coyotes?
Yeah, that would be, that's about the right proportion. We had swift fox at, less than 1% or less than 10% of the sites. We had coyotes at roughly around 70% of the sites. And we'd have multiple pictures of coyotes with a limited number of swift fox on those sites.
What about, Commissioner Spore, what about other species, reds, and badgers and things like that?
So badgers, a very high proportion of sites had badgers on them, especially in agricultural areas. No red fox whatsoever in Western Kansas that we had on camera. We actually,
That's it.
Matt just talked about elk. We had some elk on the Cimarron National Grassland on camera. A lot of bobcats, more than swift fox, actually. Unfortunately, no
That's
mountain
interesting.
lion.
Thank you.
Other questions for Ty?
Hi, would you share your presentation with Matt so he can forward it to me, please?
Okay.
Thank you.
I've got it, Sheila. I'll put it in a folder for you.
Thank you.
That was a very good and thorough report. I appreciate it very much. There are no
Thank you.
other questions. Then I think we move on to the workshop session, and we'll be enlightened by Levi.
There, can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. Levi Jaster, Emporia Research and Survey Office. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, here we're going to start with the Big Game 4 Series permanent regulations. So I'll start with 115.4-2, which is the general provisions. That includes information that must be on carcass tags, registrations, and recently we did modify that to allow hunters to, the proof of sex regulations to allow hunters to leave the worst parts of a carcass in the field to try and limit spreading chronic wasting disease. And currently this year we have no changes proposed for that regulation. So I'm going to go on to 115.4-4, which is legal equipment and taking methods. So this includes, classifying the equipment that we can use for big game species, hunter orange clothing. And we did modify that last year to include the fire stick system as legal muzzleloading equipment. And we also changed the requirement for wearing an orange hat to wearing a orange garment on the head, keeping all the amount of orange required the same. And for that regulation, we're also not proposing any changes this year. So I'll go to 115.4-6, which is the deer management units. Those constitute the 18 original units and then unit 19 that we included for urban deer management up in the Kansas City, Topeka along kind of I-70. And we did modify that unit recently to go to greater continuity of harvest management and also to try and simplify the boundary for hunters to follow easier. Clarify that. And we're not proposing any changes for that regulation this year. So that brings me to 115-4-11, which is the big game and turkey permit applications. And we do have a late addition that's not in the briefing book. And so we are considering modifying this regulation so that pronghorn hunters must either get an archery permit or apply for a limited draw permit. They would not be able to apply for the firearm or muzzleloader permits or buy a preference point for those hunts and purchase an archery permit during the same season. And the purpose of this modification would be to slightly curtail the pronghorn harvest pressure, particularly from archery, which has been very high during the recent years. And as the population has declined in certain areas. And it also may help address point creep issues that may arise as we've cut back on permits the last couple of years. And so that's the potential change we are considering under 4-11. So I would take questions on that if you want to do that now or have any.
Levi, this is Commissioner Sill. Regarding that first one, the change that was made for proof of sex, what evidence do you have of how that might have affected or changed hunter behavior? Are hunters taking advantage of that or staying with their previous manners of field dressing?
Levi Jast from Employee Research and Survey Office. I don't have any actual collected information on that, but anecdotally from conversations I've had and people talking other places, there are some that are using it and some are still holding to what they've done in the past. So.
Gerald,
Thank you.
Levi, what is point creep?
Point creep is something that much of the Western US is dealing with right now with very limited number of permits, where the people that applied early on when the preference point systems or bonus point systems were put in place for those limited tags, they have built up a large number of points. And so it keeps taking more and more points over time to actually draw the permit. And so in some cases, I have seen where people have kind of calculated things out and they figure, you know, they started buying the points back in their 20s and they're hopeful that they'll draw a permit when they retire. Some people are, even as soon as their children are born, buying permits or points for their children those first years in hopes that those children will want to hunt and then would be able to draw that point or that permit later in life. So it just keeps the number of points that a person would need to get that permit just keeps creeping up because so many people are applying and it just gets harder and harder and less desirable for people to actually try to even get those tags.
We don't sell points, do we?
We do for some of our limited entry or limited permits. So non-resident deer permits for the draw, they get a point if they apply and don't get it, but they can also buy a point without purchasing a permit that year. And then for pronghorn and elk, we also have points that can be bought, although elk is a little different, as Matt explained earlier. And so, over time, especially if you can buy a point and still get another permit and hunt that year, potentially you're adding more and more points into the system. Most of our permits, especially for non-resident deer, there's been enough that people use their points pretty quickly. And so those are kind of taken out of the system. But as more and more people would want to apply,
we could potentially start to get to where even those that have a preference point would not even, they may not get to draw that year because there are more people ahead of them in line with more points.
So what you're trying to accomplish is right now people are applying for a firearm permit for antelope. They're unsuccessful, so they go over the counter and get an archery permit and chase the goats around, whether they're going to get one or not.
And they would also then get a point for that for when they didn't draw.
So if you get an archery permit, that cancels your point.
Yes, that would be the idea, is that, if you applied earlier in the year, you would get the point, and either you can't get an archery permit if you want to keep the point, or you'd have to lose the point.
I get it. Are there other questions for Levi? Well, then go on.
All right, that would then bring me to 115.4-13, which is the deer permits, descriptions, and restrictions. And there we haven't, in 2016, we started not issuing any either species antlerless permits to help reduce our harvest of mule deer. That's still, we're still planning on continuing with that. But otherwise, we're not proposing any changes for that regulation either. And that would wrap up the 115-4 general big game permanent regulations.
Gerald Lauber, are there any questions for Levi? If not, go on to the 25 series.
All right, Levi Jaster, Emporia Research Office. The Deer 25 series regulations sets the season dates for the statewide season and deals with which units allow certain numbers of whitetail antlerless only permits. And this year with the proposed season dates, they're all following pretty much what we've done the last few years. The change that we are considering is that some of our north, central, and northwest wildlife areas have been excluded from the statewide regulation that wildlife areas only allow the first whitetail antlerless only permit to be used on them. And we are allowing 4 additional whitetail antlerless only permits on those areas. But our public land managers are concerned that we're not providing as much opportunity as we could be on those areas, and seeing some reduced deer herd sizes on those wildlife areas. And so we are considering putting Glen Elder, Canopolis, Lovewell, Norton, Webster, and Wilson wildlife areas, and potentially Kerwin National Wildlife Refuge back under the state-wide regulation that only the first antlerless only permit for whitetails could be used on those areas. But to go through the season dates, then our youth and disabled season in 2022 would be September 3rd through September 11th. Early muzzleloader would be September 12th through September 25th. Archery season would start on should be September 12th and run to December 31st. So muzzleloader and archery would open concurrently. We would hold the pre-rut antlerless whitetail only firearm season October 8th through October 10th, which is Columbus Day weekend. As we've done in the past, regular firearm season would be November 30th through December 11th. So the standard 12 days starting the Wednesday after Thanksgiving. And then the first extended antlerless January season in 2023 would be January 1st through January 8th. The second season in January would be January 1st through January 15th. And the third would be January 1st through January 22nd of 2023. And then in Management Unit 19, the extended archery season would be January 23rd through January 31st, 2023. And then again, we'd remove those wildlife areas from the exceptions list and put those back under the statewide regulation for one white-tailed antlerless only could be used on those, which would still leave Elk City and Barren Stick wildlife areas in southeast Kansas under the 4 additional permits, since we've had some deer damage complaints around those areas. And there's generally high deer numbers in southeast Kansas. So that would be the potential changes and the season dates for the 2022 to 2023 deer seasons under the Deer 25 series.
Gerald Lauber, are there any questions for Levi?
Yeah, Levi, this is Commissioner Spore. Can you explain to me why you are thinking about proposing that all these public areas just go to one permit?
Levi Jaster, Emporia. Part of it is that we're seeing some reduced numbers of deer on those areas. And also we're seeing some increased pressure from hunters. And so trying to provide the most opportunity for the most people on those wildlife areas.
Hasn't Cedar Bluff been down to one game tag for quite some time?
It has been for a while.
Like 5 years or 10 years or?
I'd have to go back and look at the records to see when it was. I can't recall off the top of my head. So.
Thank you.
Yep.
Commissioner Sill, I've had some confusion over this for a couple of years because I've seen some places that said only the first antlerless permit could be used on state land or public lands. And then I've seen it written as only one may be used. But yet, and I intentionally did this year, I bought 3 deer tags at one time. And there is no difference between those 2 antlerless carcass tags. None of them say not valid on state lands. So how, one for law enforcement, how are they supposed to tell the difference? And for clarification for hunters to know what's up with this. I realize there's partly an honor system, but it gets a little confusing. And if we can eliminate some confusion. So why, when those are printed out, why do they not say valid on state publicly owned lands, managed lands, or not valid on state managed lands?
Gerald Lauber, I had the same question. I can tell the difference between the two, subtle as it may be. On one of the lines, there's a series of units to which they're usable in, and the first deer tag that prints out has more units available. If you were to line them up, you would see there's a subtle difference. It does not say may not be used, that the other ones don't say may not be used on public lands, but you can tell the difference in the permits.
But the
I could-
units are different than public versus private. A unit includes both public and private.
Levi?
Levi and Raster Emporia, yeah, they would include that. There is an issue with limited space on tags, being able to print on those. So that's potentially something that could be explicitly put down there. The big difference to be able to recognize which tag is which is what Commissioner Lauber pointed out, was that there is a difference in the different units on there. How our law enforcement folks look at that in the field, I'd have to defer to one of them, or maybe Chris could address it.
Chris Tymason, I see Greg's on now. I'd defer to Greg to let him discuss that.
Quite frankly, I have not encountered that myself. I would probably have to talk to my folks to see how they've dealt with that in the past. Like I said, I have not encountered that myself. So I don't have a specific answer for you right now.
Levi, Raster Emporia, we did have an issue that was related to Fort Leavenworth, which is subunit 10A in Unit 10. And we did address some of that where people were hunting in Unit 10, assuming that they could hunt there during January because it said 10A, when in fact 10A is only Fort Leavenworth subunit. And so we addressed that by some additional publication. We explicitly outlined that in the regulation summary. And so that may be another way to address this, that we can add a line in the summary that specifically spells out that only that first tag could be used on state managed land.
Gerald Lauber, I think Commissioner Sill has a good point, and I wish there could be something where it says antlerless deer tag, it would say 1ST for the first antlerless deer tag, something that's a little easier than trying to see which one has the most units. Because I was confused for a long time until I began to take the permits to try to figure out how I knew the difference, and discovered the additional units are on the first tag and not the second tag. But we don't have to decide this today, but I think it would be something, if we could have just a little bit more clear demarcation, it might help.
Levi, Raster Emporia, and we are working on some system changes too. So this would probably be a great time to actually work that in and address it.
Any other questions for Levi? Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Colonel Kaiser, you want to talk about life jackets?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the commission. Greg Kaiser, I'm the Colonel of the Law Enforcement Division for Wildlife and Parks. A little bit background. During 2014, the United States Coast Guard adopted the international standards for labeling of personal flotation devices, also known as life jackets. The states were able to delay incorporating language into their statutes and regulations until the Coast Guard could secure additional testing and identify the method of incorporating the new standards with the manufacturers and providing training information for the state incorporation. The Coast Guard administers the recreational boating safety grant process. And since this is a code of federal regulations, the change of life jacket labeling is a preemptive law. All states are required to adopt the new standards into their respective laws and regulations. Failure to adopt these standards will result in the state's recreational boating safety program to be placed in a non-compliant status and could result in federal funding being suspended. The life jackets will now support a new label printed on the inside of the life jacket. The label includes a number that lets purchasers know how much buoyancy the life jacket will provide. Lower numbered jackets are more suited for near shore activities, and higher numbered jackets offer a higher buoyancy value and are more suited for offshore activities. Warnings about the activities these jackets are suited for are also included on the label and identified by an image as well as a turning ability rating. These warnings will let buyers know which jacket to get for specific water activities such as water skiing or tubing. It also lets the buyer know what symbol to look for and which jacket turns unconscious wearers face up. The older life jackets that we're currently using right now are still good as long as they're in working condition, no rips, tears, anything like that. They'll still remain, viable, and boaters can still use those as long as they're still in good working condition. And with that, I'll take any questions you may have.
Any questions for Colonel Kaiser? Okay, thank you very much. Talk about turkeys, Kent Fricky.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the commission. Kent Fricky, small game coordinator in the Emporia Research and Survey Office. I do have a brief presentation here. I'll share my screen. Start the presentation. So, as a brief reminder of our timeline, we, of course, did a general discussion back in June. And then during the workshop session back in our August commission meeting, we went over the spring season and harvest summaries to date then and talked about our overall recommendations. And then today, I'm going to follow up on that discussion more specifically with our population trend data, and again, go over our recommendations. And then at our next meeting in November, during the public hearing, we'll be voting on these recommendations. So in terms of population trends, what you'll see here in the next series of slides is that the spring abundance, or the number of turkeys that we're estimating out within the landscape, will be on the left, and that comes from our spring rural mail carrier survey. And then our estimates for production, which come from our summer rural mail carrier survey, which is conducted in July, is on the right. And so for each of these, both statewide and then within each of the turkey hunting units, you'll see, again, the spring abundance on the left, and then summer production estimates on the right. And so starting statewide, we see that in April, when we conducted this survey, we did see a continued slight decline in the turkey abundance in Kansas, again, statewide. And then we also saw just a little bit of a dip in production statewide as well on the right graph there. And again, as we move through these, you'll see which specific units went up and down during the past year. And so when we start in Western Kansas, on the left, again, starting with spring abundance, we see that the Northwest, which is the bold line on top, was relatively similar in the number of turkeys that we saw on the land in Unit 1. And then we saw some, again, slight declines in the Southwest, which is the dotted line. And on the right side for production, we saw the Northwest recover a little bit. Again, still definitely not great for production this summer. But then we did see a slight decline that kind of continued in Southwest Kansas in Unit 4. In Central Kansas, Unit 2, the North Central unit, bounced back a little bit in terms of spring abundance. Again, important to note for certainly this year and a couple years more, that we did have the flooding events and extreme precipitation back in 2019. And I do believe that we're continuing to see the results of that in our spring abundance estimates. And if you'll remember, we certainly had some negative impacts on that in the eastern part of the state, but some of the most severe impacts on our production was in the central part of the state, as you see on the right, the production graph on the right for 2019. And so again, we're seeing that slow recovery potentially in the North Central Unit 2, but then in the South Central, we're seeing still a pretty steep decline from the early 2010s time period. So certainly concerning in terms of the number of turkeys in Unit 5 for sure. And then again, on the right, you see especially the extremely low results for production in 2019. We had a decent bounce back in 2020, but then that tapered off again here in 2021. And then finally, in the eastern 2 units, we see that the Northeast had continued. We saw the continued decline in spring abundance estimates. So on the left in the solid line. But we did see just a little bit of a recovery in the southeastern Unit 6. But some good news is that in both the Unit 3 and Unit 6, the northeast and southeastern units, we did see some pretty decent production this year. And so as you can see, we've been about average, or this is about average for the last almost 10 years. However, again, to note that this is still relatively low. If you look back from the 2000 to 2010 time period, you'll see that we were very much on an increasing production trend. But since that time, we've been very low compared to those times when we were seeing expanding populations in these 2 units. And then hot off the press from the other half of the small game program, Jeff Prendergast just completed and posted online the brood survey efforts from results from this year's brood survey that the department does, which is separate from the real mail carrier survey, but has usually pretty similar results. You'll see that, again, in terms of production this year, this is not compared to other years. And so even if everything was low, you'll see that the dark green is basically the best production that we had during this year compared to the rest of the state. And so you'll see again here that this goes along fairly similarly with the real mail carrier survey results, in that we saw pretty decent production, especially in the Northeast, pretty decent production in the extreme southeastern portion of the state as well, and just didn't see real good results in the western part of the state. This wouldn't be bad to me, looking back through time. This is something that we would want to see and what we would expect, right? Where in the eastern portion of the central and eastern portions of the state, we've got the most turkeys around. We have the most turkey habitat. And so this would typically be a really good year. Again, we're lacking the number of turkeys to where we see some of the bigger jumps in production. So that poults per hen just isn't, getting a lot better because we don't have that many hens out there producing like we did 10 to 15 years ago. And then this graph or image just shows the difference between 2020 and 2021. And so you'll see that in 2020, we had fairly decent production in the western part of the state. And again, we saw decreases in that this year. So you see where that comes up on the red side of things. So there was a lower production estimates this year. But then in the eastern portions of the state, the southeastern really bounced back a little bit more from what they had been in 2020. And so that's good. And because the southeastern portion of the state has been one of the most concerning areas for the lack of production, given the amount of turkey habitat in that unit. And so again, not that much change in the eastern part of the state, but we did see some declines in the western 2/3 of the state compared to 2020. So, and just want to do a recap then of our overall recommendations that we're coming forth with this year. And so first we wanted to touch on spring and fall bag limits. Again, we're not recommending any changes to the bag limits for either the spring or the fall seasons for 2022. And so just quickly for units 1 and 2, the Northwest and North Central, that means we're recommending a spring bag limit of 2 birds and a fall bag limit of 1 bird. And again, as I mentioned during our August meeting, we have had significant discussion both within the turkey committee and from other staff that are concerned about the turkey population and especially turkey hunting pressure during the spring season in these 2 units, because there's a relatively high amount of public access, and especially non-residents and a certain number of residents are going to these units for that second bird. And so we have seen some increase. We did see some increases in pressure and number of hunters in these units, especially unit 2 during 2021. And so we're keeping a really close eye on that. But again, we are not recommending any change there. Units 3, 5, and 6, the Northeast, South Central, and the Southeast, we continue to recommend staying with the 1 spring bird and 1 fall bird. And then the same for unit 4, the Southwest unit, where it's a limited draw, 500 permits for the spring only with no fall season. A quick recap of our turkey season date discussions and recommendations. Again, I won't belabor this too much in terms of the structure that's laid out in regulation. Basically, each group gets kind of at least 1 weekend during the spring season. And again, the fall season has been reduced from October 1st to November 10th. So for next year, and this is already set, the youth season will be April 1st through 12th. The archery season in yellow will be April 4th to the 12th. And then the regular season for 2022 will start on April 13th. And again, the fall season, October 1st through November 10th. And then our recommendation for 2023 is basically no recommended change and to stick with the current structure. And of note, you'll notice that this is the earliest, given the calendar cycle changing every 7 years. This is the shortest youth only season. It's a Saturday, Sunday, the 1st and 2nd, and then the regular season will start on the 12th. So that's the earliest that the season would start under the current structure. Just a few years ago, we were at the latest of April 18th for the latest start date. And then a quick recap of the various discussions we've had on the youth season eligibility. As a reminder, we've been standardizing these for the last 6 months across our game species. Currently for turkeys, we're not recommending any changes to the youth permit eligibility. So in order to buy a youth permit, you have to be 15 or under, and that's state statute. So we would have to change that within the legislature. But to be eligible for the youth season, currently it's 16 and under. So if you're 16 and over, or if you were 16, you would still have to buy a regular full price permit, but you are eligible for the youth season. And we are recommending changing that to 17 and under. So if you're 16 and 17, you would still have to purchase a full price permit, but you would be eligible to participate in the youth spring turkey season, since we don't have a fall youth season. And then finally, legal equipment recommendations. Again, currently we do not allow handguns as legal methods of take in either the spring or fall turkey seasons. I polled the country's state biologists this winter, and currently 15 of the 36 responses I got, 15 do allow handguns to be used for shot shooting handguns for turkeys, with 4 of them only in the fall, and 21 do not allow, including Kansas currently. In surrounding states, Missouri does not allow, Nebraska does, and then both Oklahoma and Colorado do not allow shot shooting handguns during the spring, but they do allow them during their fall seasons. Again, generally the feedback that we've gotten, both positive and negative, in terms of negative, we have had significant concerns and discussion about potential low lethality of concerns with the distance of shots placed with these handguns because of the shorter barrel length associated with that. But we also recognize that there is a potential use by handicapped hunters and people wanting to utilize other equipment rather than only crossbows, vertical bows, and regular shoulder mounted shotguns. And so currently, as we discussed in our August meeting, we are recommending that we allow shot shooting handguns for both the spring and fall with the following restrictions. First is a 10-inch minimum barrel length, including the chamber. The barrel must be choked. And similar to our shoulder mounted shotguns, we recommend that the restriction of using size 2 to 9 shot be placed on those. So just to recap, no recommended changes for the 2022 bag limits, no recommended changes to the season structure for 2023. And then we're recommending changing the youth season eligibility to 17 and under, and then recommending that that handguns be allowed with those restrictions during both the spring and fall seasons. And I will note, and I placed this in the briefing book, as noted this in the briefing book item as well, that we did flag just a language definition cleanup that we need to do for Unit 2. Basically, just in the description of the unit, we just need to close the circle with the language there. And so when you see that language, proposed language in the briefing book item for the November meeting, you'll see that we'll clean that up for voting on that as well. And again, just a reminder where we're at in the process. So we ran through the season summaries for harvest, the population trends, and then we'll be going to vote in the next meeting in November. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'd be happy to stand for questions.
Thank you, Kent. Gerald here. Are there any questions for Kent on any of these matters?
Kent, this is Commissioner Spohr. Given the fact that we went to one permit in half the state, how concerned are you that in 2021 we sold 45,000 permits and harvested 16,000 birds? How big a concern is that for you? And then also looking at, the percentages of non-residents purchasing, is that a concern for you?
It's something that we always certainly keep an eye on. And so to put that in context too, the 45,000 permits, or the carcass tags, I should say, is that, of the slightly less than 30,000 or about 30,000 hunters that we had in the state, about what was the percentage? I think we had 35 or 38% non-residents in the state. And so most of those, because they're traveling, no matter what unit they're hunting, they tend to purchase that second game tag, right? And so those 15,000 game tags are figured into that carcass tag number. And so from that, if you have about 30,000 hunters, we still did fairly well in terms of our hunter success for that first bird, which is what we report on typically. And so we still had 46% hunter success. So in general, I think we're doing okay. Again, that's still a much higher hunter success rate than most states have. The other exception being primarily Nebraska, but they've seen some declines in recent years as well. And so I think we're doing okay there. And again, we've just had a large number of non-residents in the state consistently for about 20 years. And they've consistently been 30 to 40% of our spring turkey season hunter population. And so I think, personally, I think we're doing relatively well in terms of making the changes that we've needed to make to the spring season to limit any potential over harvest, but we are certainly keeping an eye on that for sure.
Thank you.
Are there other questions for Kent? Well, thank you. Hearing none. That's the end of the agenda for this afternoon. We will go ahead and recess. It's a little early. We will reconvene at 6:30. Before we reconvene this afternoon at 6:30, is there anything, Secretary Lovelace, you'd like to bring up? At some point, we're going to have to discuss whether or not we will have a virtual meeting in November. Statistics on COVID, while they may be improving some, don't exactly look like it's going to be a lot better. And I don't know whether we want to have that discussion now or have it this after in the evening session.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman Brad Lovelace, Secretary. I don't have anything else to add to the agenda, but to me, with a little bit of time now, it'd be great to get feedback from the commissioners as far as what they're thinking about that November meeting. I would say, from the state perspective, we're trying to be as cautious as we can and appreciate the commission's understanding of that and accommodation with these virtual meetings. I would ask Chris, based on timing of advertising, how soon, I guess Chris's mode, I think he's had a wise strategy in advertising the meetings as we're required to do and as we want to do, but leaving us flexible as far as the exact mode of the meetings. Chris, do you have an opinion on that as far as when we need to commit to one mode or another or a hybrid meeting? Do you have an opinion?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Secretary, Chris Tymason. So I publish the notices as in-person meetings, and if we have to convert to a virtual meeting, we just have to notify there are legal requirements to vote, and we've met the legal requirements to vote. It's more of a procedural issue at that point to decide how much notice we should provide the public and to rearrange all those plans, to shift people into virtual mode versus in-person mode. And usually that's, we've been trying to do a couple of weeks out as that's possible.
Mm-hmm. So Mr. Chair, Secretary Lovelace, if you're comfortable, we can kind of hedge our bets and defer a final judgment. On the other hand, if the commission feels strongly that we ought to make a decision now and want to be careful and say, let's just plan on that being virtual, we certainly understand that, but we do have time if you want to defer that judgment until we have more data later.
I'm fine, Gerald Lauber, I'm fine with deferring that decision later. We'll know a little more what the governor's thoughts are on things as we get closer to that meeting. I think it'd be good to try to make a decision 2-3 weeks out, but we got some time, and I'm okay with staff making the recommendation. But we'll see what the other commissioners want. Personally, I think there is a likelihood we'll find ourselves with another virtual meeting. But if things change dramatically and we may want to change that, then that's fine. I guess we could just leave it as a live meeting with expectation that by 1st of November, staff will have made a recommendation and we'll just follow your lead. That's what I'm thinking to do.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Brad Lovell, Secretary. We're very comfortable doing that, looking at the data on COVID and listen to what other guidance we get from the governor. But as the chairman said, we welcome input from other commissioners.
Commissioner Gfeller, I'm comfortable with that approach, Brad.
Commissioner Ryder, I'm okay with waiting on a decision, but I do like a live meeting rather than virtual.
Mm-hmm.
I agree. I prefer live meetings over virtual myself. It has been apparent that we can get the necessary business done. We haven't had any, we've had some discussion, some controversy, and we've been able to work through it virtually. So I think we'll just wait and let the secretary and staff make a decision by November 1st. Well, if there's anybody else has anything to say, we can listen to it, or we can just recess and reconvene. Anybody have
This
any?
is Commissioner.
Yeah, Mike.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Commissioner Spore.
Oh, my question was can anybody give me an update on how the teal season is going at Cheyenne Bottoms this year?
Mr. Chair, I think I can do that. I was out there, as was Mike Miller, just yesterday, and let me, this is Brad Lovell, Secretary. Let me check. Got Rich Schulteis is on, and let me look who else. If I would offer, if someone else wants to chime in, Stuart Schrog, I'm looking at others that are might have better data than me, but I can tell you what I heard from people yesterday when we met out in Great Bend. So not seeing anybody else. Stuart, you want to summarize? Go ahead. Thank you.
Well, yeah, Stuart Schrog, Director of Public Lands out of Pratt. I can just give a brief summary of the teal opener out of Cheyenne Bottoms that I received from Jason Wagner. As many of you, all of you know, we're heavily under construction at the bottoms currently, so we were not able to flood as many acres as we normally would, and that's caused a little consternation with some, but they most see the long-term big picture positive effects that the construction is going to create. So minor grumblings in that regard, but still overall pretty good crowds. Staff on site felt like they were a little overcrowded, just like I said, because of the lack of water in all the pools that we normally would have. It sounds like there were maybe a little bit higher percentage of non-residents overall, but total numbers were about normal. It sounds like guys are shooting a lot of limits. Hunters are shooting a lot of limits sporadically, though. It sounds like the last couple of days this week have been hit and miss more than it was on opening weekend. In regards to the new boating regulations that you all imposed for the bottoms, it sounds like a lot of people were really pleased that the motorized disturbance was not like it had been in the past, and we really didn't have any issues surrounding those new regulations. So hunters are still enjoying quite a bit of success, even in the limited pools that do have water in them. So still a good chance to go out and harvest some birds.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I might add a little bit. Stuart's right on with his summary of that. One other thing that I heard when I was out there, this is an interesting twist. Of course, we had a lot of discussions about last year's waterfowl season and the impact of hunter numbers and all that kind of thing. An interesting twist that I heard was that initially they had a good opening day, and then just like we experienced last year, it fell off a little bit with the pressure, particularly with the limited water that we have out there this year. But something we can't control, the weather. We had a little cold snap, like, as I understand, about a week after the opener, and that pushed some new birds down. So that's kind of extended the quality harvest that Stuart mentioned. A lot of people talked about several days having really good success, and the habitat that Jason has been able to manage, where he has been able to control water. Vegetation was terrific, and water levels were great. And so to Stuart's point, I'd say with the limitations that we have as we plan for long-term success out there, I think they've done a lot with it. And I perceive, like Stuart did, the hunters are pretty happy with what they've experienced.
Yeah, Stuart Schrog again, Public Lands Director. For that opening Saturday, I think there were around 414 people checked in with an average of 4 birds per hunter. So that's pretty good success.
Any other questions?
Mr. Chairman.
Yes.
Assistant Secretary Mike Miller. I was going to circle back to the Antlerless Permit question that Lauren had asked, and I'm not making excuses because I'm not sure this is the best option, but I think we are limited currently with what we can print on those licenses. And in the regulation, it does specify that there's one permit that's available, that's open statewide, except for Unit 7 or Unit 18, as well as state wildlife areas and walk-in. And then it lists under the additional permits which units are valid in and which wildlife areas are valid on. This is something I think we can work on with our new license vendor. I think Jessica's Mounts is on this. This will be some of the discussions that we have with them as far as how we can designate the validity of these permits and where they're valid on. And maybe we can make some improvements on that as we work toward a new vendor in the next year.
Any other questions? We're going to recess the meeting and reconvene at 6:30. Have a good afternoon.